And we're recording, and you're gone. All right, people of the pod. Welcome back to season 4. I think we're up at episode 4. We missed a week because my co-host Dave Karp was feeling ill. I'm Peter Loge. We're starting all over again, Alana. We're starting because I forgot my own name.
Look, it can only get better from here.
One would think. One might be wrong. Well, welcome back, people of the pod, to Office Hours with Karp and Loge. I am, as always, Peter Loge, a strategic communications professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University and a strategic communications consultant. I'm joined, as I am at this time, every other-ish week by
Dave Karp, also a professor at George Washington University. It's Office Hours with Karp and Loge. We're a week late because when I got COVID, I really got COVID. Peter Loge earlier this season was able to have COVID and just go ahead and record the pod. Me, no. I get COVID, I am out.
I toughed it out.
But we're back now.
I toughed it out.
Back now. It's look, you're a tougher fellow than me.
Damn right. I put out on the social medias that we were going to be a week late because the Karp clan caught COVID, which I thought was clever, and nobody responded.
Right, yeah, but in everyone's defense, you said that on Twitter, and there's no one left on Twitter.
I don't know.
Twitter broke yesterday.
that.
Links and images didn't work. Yeah. And I checked to see what's Elon Musk doing, and he was reply guying Jordan Peterson. That was the good use of his time.
I'm just saying, nobody even they could have emailed and said, "Hey, I missed you this week. I hope Dave's okay." And let's get to it. A couple of things. Those of you who are still listening, condolences. Follow us, rate us, review us. So the last time we had an episode, there was some talk of the West Wing, and a listener named Stephanie did in fact reach out on Twitter saying more West Wing references. So we're here for you, Stephanie. And I also have to say, I did I had a walking meeting, which is a thing. I guess you meet somebody, you don't get coffee or sit. You go on a walk, and it's a walk
and talk, yeah.
A walk and talk, and it was great. Yeah. Somebody I hadn't seen in a long time, and he had to walk his dog, and it's a lovely area up by Sligo Creek. Because there's a 90-minute walk, so we're not going 90 today, people. And I discovered the downside of walking meetings is if you're getting coffee and you're sitting somewhere, you look at the time and go, "Holy cow, I've got to run." You can't do that if you're on a walk in Sligo Creek. You're I have got to text several people to tell them I'm going to be late. 90-minute dog walk, 3 podcasts.
It's Office Hours with Karp and Loge, where Peter Loge complains about walking meetings that he had. You should publish this on your renamed website, lemonlyman.com.
It was it involved exercise. It was lovely. It was really lovely. It was great to catch up. I just thought I needed to think through the logistics a bit more. And there's also a 90-minute dog walk. So where are we going? We got a bunch to cover. You got sick at a really bad time. A lot of stuff happened. You could have been a little more.
I'm sorry my health was inconvenient for you. I'm really sorry that my sickness inconvenienced you.
As long as you understand the impact you had. All right. So you want to start with stuff though? Oh, no, we're starting with my stuff. So we're talking about ChatGPT, generative AI, large language models. It's all a thing. I want to do 2 things. One is on this coming Friday, March the 10th, Dave Karp and I and one of our students who is taking both my political communication ethics class and his strategic communications class, named Yvonne. She's going to join us for a conversation about ChatGPT, ethics, and political campaigns. There's a lot to unpack. There are a lot to talk about. And
one other panelist too?
And much more. Yes, one other panelist is one. Zainab Chowdhury, who's an adjunct instructor here in SMPA, a strategic communications consultant at a firm called New Heights Communication, who's been putting a lot of work and thought into this as well. Sorry, Zainab. I think it'll be interesting. And much more to come on that. But that's not what I want to talk about generative AI today. I want to talk about its use in strategic communications. I want to flag a couple of quick things to get your feedback. The first is and I'll put all these links on peterloge.com podcast and also on my Medium page for the footnotes. First is a political consulting firm in California has tips for their clients and candidates on using ChatGPT. Most consulting firms have, guides or tips or tools. It's a way to bring clients in the door and a way to be useful. This one has it for if you're a campaign, how to use it. It's just straight up some tips. There's also a piece from the Polarization and Social Change Lab and the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence at Stanford asked ChatGPT and a human to write persuasive messages, and they tested the messages, sent them out to a bunch of people. Which one persuaded you more? What do you think? And across all three comparisons conducted, the AI generated messages were, quote, consistently persuasive to human readers, with the effect size were relatively small, falling within a range of a few points in a scale of 0 to 100. Such small moves extrapolated across polarizing topic and the voting population scale could prove significant. For instance, the authors report that AI generated messages were at least as persuasive as human generated messages across all topics on smoking ban, gun control, carbon tax, increased child credit, and parental leave program. Participants became significantly more supportive of the policies when reading AI produced texts. So this is a way in which strategic communications folks could use generative AI, actually are using generative AI, apart from the ethics piece, just the mechanics piece. What do you think, Dave?
I have some concerns.
Okay.
So one thing that I noticed this past week, which I'll be writing about for Substack later on this week, Wired Magazine also just came out with their policies for how they're going to use generative AI, AI images, the whole lot. And as the Wired reading guy, I of course read that with great interest. And I think their policies are really good. And what they're saying is we are not going to use generative AI to write our stories. They're going to use it a little bit on the internal sausage making process. So they're going to play around with, if you need to generate a bunch of different headline options and then have your editors select which one's best, you can probably use generative AI to generate a bunch of those headline options and then have humans do the real work. In general, I think we can be thinking of generative AI as a cliche generator and recognize that humans are also cliche generators. And if what you need to do is sort of boilerplate stuff, then it can be a very helpful starter. I don't think it's something that you ever want to finish with, though. And I think right now the hype bubble around it is leading a lot of people to say, we should embrace this. We should be finishing with this. We should be cutting lots of corners. I think we're going to be looking back a couple of years from now and saying that the smartest actors in using generative AI were the ones who didn't want to get out ahead of anything. Like right now, there's a lot of hype around it, and also we don't really know what the limitations are or where it goes bad. I wouldn't rush. I certainly wouldn't have AI be doing your writing for you. If you want to use it for something you're drafting and then do a bunch of editing, okay, if you got too much on your plate, sure, maybe do that. But I think this is one of the few cases where you don't really want to be technologically on the cutting edge, because right now we are the ones being experimented on. We are figuring out, where is this thing going to fall apart for you? I don't think you want to be the campaign, the candidate, the advocacy organization that gets to have that experience.
Well, I think you've seen this already with a couple of universities put out AI generated statements because there was a disclaimer at the bottom generated by AI, which is, just kind of offensive given the circumstances. But I think that you're right. It's a first draft tool. I've talked to my students about this. Some of my grad students who are working in the real world, one of whom was in a metal band. And he said that he uses it if he has writer's block, or it'll generate a first draft. There's Campaigns and Elections, which is an online publication for the political campaign industry, had a couple of pieces written by consultants on generative AI. And neither consultant said they're using it for their clients. Both said it basically does the work of an entry-level staffer, just blindingly fast and for free. Yeah. So it's like, it'll replace an intern, but a grown-up has to look at it, make sure it's accurate, because generative AI can't, it's going wildly astray with some facts. You want to make sure it's not too much of a cliche generating machine, but it'll give you something with which to work.
Yeah, and we should be clear that's still a meaningful breakthrough that seemed pretty impossible a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that you can just blindingly fast and for free, though I think that for free is going to change over time. We don't know the business model on this stuff yet, as we talked about before. But sorry, my kid is running and yelling in the background. Ilana, we're going to need to edit out a pause because my 2-year-old is very cute. Sorry, give me 1 second. I need to. He's yelling for Elsa right now. I think it's lovely when my 2-year-old has a bunch of imaginary princess friends. Anyway, sorry, I need to recollect.
Business model.
Right. I think it's important for us to note that this is something 2 years ago would have largely seemed impossible to be able to enter for free, at least for now, because we have to see what the business models are going to look like, as I've said before. But the fact that for free you can have an AI network produce the work that's of the quality of an entry-level staffer, that's very impressive. And also, if the work you're putting out there is of the quality of an entry-level staffer, you're telling on yourself. You probably don't want to be that organization. And you certainly don't want to send the broad signal that we think our work is no better than what generative AI could do right now. Like, I haven't read this Stanford study yet, but the first question I have is, okay, if you were testing generative AI against a human, who's that human and how good are they at persuasive messaging?
Right. I think all of that is accurate, but so for our listeners who are comms people, good first draft tool, play with it, keep on top of it, but always have a person give the last read to make sure it's accurate, it's as compelling as possible. You know, if you're sending out generic pitch emails, you know, fine, whatever. Reporters don't really read those anyway. Yeah. But if it matters, be super careful, but also think about internal policies, the way Wired magazine has, things like that. And again, there'll be an ethics event on March 10th, where we're going to be talking the ethics of this, because I think the ethics of it get really complicated with, does it have to be true or not? Where does truth lie? This is a debate that goes back at least to the sophists. There are questions already in lobbying. It's generating mail, that kind of stuff. That's Friday's conversation with you.
Yeah, a lot of things are going to get messy and bad. I mean, my note to comms professionals is take pride in your craft and also worry about downside risk right now, because a couple of people are going to get really burned and you don't want to be that person. Yeah.
Right, exactly. A lot to be considered here. Again, Friday, Zainab, you, me, Yvonne, and much more to be continued. So, very practical look at a very big thorny problem. You have a new Substack as of this morning when recording, as of yesterday morning when it drops, and as of who the heck knows when somebody finally gets around to listening to this nonsense. Talk.
I think people listen to this the second it comes out. I think our listeners are thirsting for this content and they stop whatever they're doing, walk a dog, and listen to the podcast. That's what I believe.
So go get a dog and start walking people.
Look, that is a good message from this podcast. Go get a dog. Dogs are great. So the bit I wrote about was I feel like I kind of am going against type here a little bit. There's a new piece out in The Atlantic by George Packer, who is a lovely prose stylist and who also I kind of get annoyed by sometimes. And he is one of the people who was often complaining about cancel culture and how, you know, like words, meanings are changing these days and it's just terrible and you can't say anything. And his new piece is taking aim at style guides within advocacy and activist organizations. He leads with the Sierra Club. So of course, like I immediately paid attention because if you say strategic political communication and Sierra Club in the mirror 3 times, I appear. I'm like Beetlejuice.
Which several of our listeners will get.
Yeah, several. And for listeners who don't know, I spent my teens and my 20s in the Sierra Club, was a leader in the Sierra Student Coalition, then 6 years in the Sierra Club board. All of my political instincts come from that organization in particular. So I took a look at the Sierra Club style guide and I found myself kind of mostly agreeing with George Packer on this one. I think he's doing 2 things in his article. I think he's doing sort of the standard old man yells at clouds cancel culture riff. I have no patience for that anymore. So I'm with everybody else who's critiquing him. But I also think narrowly, the large advocacy organizations that over the past few years have decided that they need to go on a sort of organizational journey to change how they speak, has led them to forget some sort of first principles of political communication. I think you should be aware of your language and not cause unnecessary harm, and you should also make sure that you're talking normal. And I was reading through the Sierra Club style guide, which came out, I guess, in 2021, but you know, I'm not in the organization anymore, so I hadn't seen it at the time. And the number of sort of normal phrases from everyday life that are casually dropped into metaphors. Things like, what do you stand for? The word retirement, empowerment, rule of thumb. All of these, if you have a large enough committee discussing what kind of language might be problematic, made it onto their list. And then they offered suggestions, and most of the suggestions were basically like, don't use 2 words when 5 might do the trick. And the narrow version of what George Packer was saying is this leads to awful writing. It's unpersuasive, bad habits, don't do it. And I think he's right. I think that's a problem that I see creeping into a lot of progressive advocacy communications, that there's sort of a shift in focus away from who is our audience and how do we speak clearly to them, towards who are our potential allies and how do we make sure that none of them are offended. And again, like, I don't think you should, I think you should make sure not to cause necessary offense. But I think there is a real problem when, as an organization, you stop focusing on your audience and who you want to move and how do we most clearly articulate that, and instead start trying to make sure that none of your language might cause any offense. Probably the biggest flag for me is the style guide said not to use the word Americans. Like, look, if a progressive advocacy organization is deciding, do you want to invoke and claim patriotism, or do you want to stay away from it because it's problematic? Dude, invoke and claim patriotism. Like, your values are patriotic values. That's problematic for people. Your allies are going to understand what you're trying to do there. Don't leave patriotism to the other side, because it would be nice to win, please. So it was just a lot there that I found myself stewing on and kind of thinking, look, I don't think this is like a grand threat to civil society, but this does seem to be a trend where advocacy organizations are forgetting first principles in communication. And in so doing, they are making their own communication jobs harder. Don't make your job harder if your job is one that is worth doing.
I think this, it's a really interesting and important conversation. And I want to, and it gets really nuanced, very complicated, very fast. On one hand, part of my instinct is to go right to the linguistic turn of philosophy and what do words do, and where is meaning outside of language, and we construct language, we don't use language uses us, all of that. Words matter. How people call themselves matter. How we call each other matters. Mm-hmm. And language at some level defines who we are, and we then define language. Language is always shifting and moving. All of those things are true. And there's language you should not use. Just don't. Yeah. But I agree that if from a strategic communications perspective, to like straight strategy, persuasion is about getting somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise do, which means there has to be a somebody, and that somebody has to be in charge of an outcome you want. Yeah. Right. If I want a piece of legislation passed, it's not my little sister. She's nice and she's a suburban mom in Connecticut. Right. If I need to persuade my sister to do something, that's one thing. But so who has power? What did they find persuasive? How are they framing and viewing the world? What language resonates with them? Mm-hmm. Speak their language. Yeah. And if you can use, don't speak their language if it's awful, right? Don't be absurdly hyperbolic, but don't be afraid to use metaphors that resonate with them, right? Metaphors are a way of saying, oh, here's my understanding of the world. I get it. You're one of me, right? Language brings together people, binds us in ways that other things don't. So consciously do that. And know that if you choose not to, if you say, I'm not going to say Americans, right? When I write for clients or in politics, I try not to say citizens. I try to say, people here, people living in the United States. Like, I try to finesse that, but that's a choice I make, knowing it might be a little bit less strategic, but I want to recognize my friends who are here, who, the IN or the DHS might not want to be here, but that's a strategic choice. Yeah. Right. Because and if you go completely, I'm going to use all of these words that are somehow magical and special and pure, they're unpersuasive, they don't talk to anybody. You might think you are creating a better community, but you're not really talking to anybody. And that's a strategic choice. That might be fine. You might think, you know what, we would rather be deontologically right than to affect policy change. But that's a strategic choice, and at some level it's an ethical choice, because you're saying that this set of ethical values, this deontological position about my language shall do no harm, setting aside whether or not that's even possible, is more important than what I am paid to do on climate, voting rights, recycling, criminal justice, transportation, whatever it happens to be. And I fully agree. I teach George Orwell. This is my copy, much marked up.
Yeah, you're holding it up on your podcast right now.
We're on YouTube. We have viewers on YouTube. One of our colleagues subscribed to this YouTube channel, so just watch yourself there, Skippy. But also the William Zinsser, who wrote one of the great books on
Yeah.
writing called On Writing Well, and clutters the disease of American writing. Say simply what you want to say.
Yeah, the one other bit that I want to just add on there, strategic communication is about making choices, and all strategy is about making choices. And the two other things that stick out for me here is I worry about the habit of only talking to ourselves and our close allies, right? Like strategically, you need to choose, who am I focusing on? Am I focusing on my target? Am I focusing on my opponents? Am I focusing on some audience that isn't convinced yet? And sometimes what you need to focus on, actually where you need to focus, is your allies. That's fine. But if the habit becomes inward facing of, we are only talking for ourselves in ways that we all agree are the ways one should talk, that is self-isolating. That's a choice. And that's a choice that you should make very consciously, as opposed to sort of bureaucratic drift. And that bureaucratic point is the last point, because I was talking with a friend on Twitter about this, and she noted, like, look, you look at AOC, there's plenty of people who can use this inclusive language and also be very persuasive. And I think that's right. There's a way that you can certainly artfully do this at the individual level. But I would also say, as you scale up to organizations, you then need to bureaucratize this. You need to say, okay, in an organization with hundreds of staff, thousands of leaders like the Sierra Club, how are we going to make this not just a policy document, but actually a set of habits that we follow? And that's going to be a major lift. That's a huge amount of work that you need to undertake, which strategically means we're focusing on this work, on cleaning up and repairing our language, as opposed to other work. Now, this isn't to say, oh, hey, let's never change any language. Language changes, you should go along with it. The rule that I followed back in my youth activist days, not around language, but around other things. You know, I was an environmental activist in the 90s, and I lived in the suburbs. So I had to decide, like, what gasoline will I put into my car? Because all of the gas companies are bad. And my rule was always, if there's an active campaign that I respect, I'm going to follow it. So in the 90s, we were fighting Shell Oil. I would not go to Shell Oil. I'm not going to fill my car with Shell because there's an active campaign going on there. That means I am going to fill it with Exxon, even though Exxon's also bad, because there's no campaign for change. And without campaigns, nothing changes. So I would say a good rule for organizations is, when there is an active campaign from people you respect saying we need to reclaim this word or problematize this word and change it, you should go along with that. Like, don't be the people who are fighting the tides. But I don't think you want to try to go all the way ahead of everybody and find every single problematic word and purify it from your language. Because what you primarily want to focus on is talking normal and communicating clearly. You don't need to be out in front of everyone with perfect language. You need to respect campaigns and go along with them. But the rest of the time, just make sure that people are communicating clearly.
And you also need to bring people along, right? So I got you here. Now let's take the next step. I got you here. Let's take the next step, right? We often talk about this on this podcast, and both of us during our classes. It's what now, what next, then what, right? And how is your language setting up the next win? How do you develop yourself as an ally to get to the next thing? And it's also to sort of release this idea that there's a pure language through which we will all be redeemed and the truth will be revealed. That's not how language works. And if that moment ever comes, democracy is over and language is over, because language will have revealed the truth, and we'll all simply bask in the glowing light. We will have unlocked the Platonic form somehow. And that's not, like, in comms as a strategy, that's just not what we do here.
Yeah. Also, as an organization, if what you really care about is being good allies, do that through your work, not your words.
Yeah, well,
like,
but
sure,
yes,
I care about words too, but like, yes, but really, like, I don't think your allies are going to really applaud that loudly and that long because you changed your internal style language. They might notice, and particularly if it's stuff that they really care about, take that seriously. But focus on your work. Focus on how can we actually be useful to you, because this song ain't about you. Otherwise, your allies are going to say, like, okay, that's nice that you're on this journey. We've got real problems. How are you helpful to us? If you want to be good allies, be good allies. Focus on the work.
Agreed. And again, I think it's complicated, and I don't want to undersell how complicated and important this can be. And I think your AOC example is a really good one, which is she's really good at this. And you can use inclusive language, and organizations are not as good at it because you have to have a style guide and all the stuff. A lot of it comes down to judgment and individuals. And so it's not a thou shalt never and thou shalt always. It's thou shalt figure out what the moment calls for. right? You're fond of saying, read the room. As strategists, read the room and know, again, whatever you decide, you're making a strategic choice, which means you're making it like easier or harder to win or lose in a situation. And the strategic choices have strategic and ethical consequences. So weigh those. Clock is running. We got a bunch of stuff to cover.
You're up
Anything
next.
else?
What do you want to talk? I got one more thing, but why don't you go next?
No, well, I just got a bunch of stuff I want to rattle off.
I want to take a second. CPAC was this past weekend, Concerted Political Action conference, and it was an empty shell of its old awful self. McKay Coppins in The Atlantic wrote it up. A bunch of other people on Twitter were talking about, so showing images of the empty room. It's basically a bunch of angry Trumpists still in there, sort of, complaining about where did the rest of the party go, while the rest of the party isn't even showing up anymore. And like, A, I want to laugh about this because, like, haha, I hate you guys. But B, there's, I think, a deeper thing here that we want to call out and be happy about. I'm actually going to be sunny and positive for a second. I know,
That's
totally off brand this week. I know.
How's it? So the COVID recovery is going slowly. This is
Super
COVID brain?
slowly.
That's what's going on?
It has changed me. So one of my sort of real downer notes over the past several years, as we've heard on this podcast before, is that only the Republican Party can fix the Republican Party. In 2018, 2020, 2022, the main note that I've been making was that is really hard to do and it takes time. We're not there yet, but I do want to point out that the reason why CPAC is so empty, along with Matt Schlapp being, he's the guy who runs it, and he's got a sexual harassment scandal right now. But the other thing that's going on here is, after 2022 going poorly against expectations for Republicans, we're now seeing the infighting break to the surface. Like 2022 or 2024 is going to be a much bigger mess for that party than it would have been if they had won in 2022 the way they thought that they would. And like, this is good. Let them fight. Because what we're seeing now with CPAC becoming a ghost town is the institutional centers of the Republican Party network that were bad centers, but those were the institutional centers. Those are starting to fracture. And if 2024 goes poorly for them, that's when those things are really going to fall apart. That doesn't mean the Republican Party will naturally become better, but that's going to be the window of opportunity where finally the Republican Party might fix the Republican Party. Like, they need to keep on losing, being embarrassed, and then fighting with each other over it. That's what's happening right now. And so not only should we make fun of them because it is fun to make fun of them, but also, like, I see some real hope in seeing these malignant institutions start to crumble. Because if 2022 had gone poorly, these institutions wouldn't be crumbling, and it would be bad. So this is a good thing. Let us celebrate their misery.
And indeed, as comms people highlight it, if somebody asks what's going on, well, clearly CPAC shows, it's an old road show that can't even fill, a basement dinner theater club. Clearly the Republicans are in disarray. Clearly the American people just want common sense solutions to things like, jobs, climate, things like that. All right.
Right now, one thing we learned from CPAC is that Republicans really hate trans people. But the other thing we're learning from CPAC is that Republicans really hate other Republicans.
Right.
Focus on that point too, because that's where the hope comes in.
Right. So comms people focus on it. So I got a bunch of stuff I want to throw up.
Please.
I'm also going to put in the links. So interesting new book by Katie Borum, who's on the faculty at American University. She did an interesting interview with WAMU. How comedy is going to fuel social change. The revolution will be hilarious. And I think that's really interesting to read back to back with a Glacius piece that you flagged on Slow Boring that I'll also throw in about why constant doomsaying is bad for the left, right? If there is no optimism, if there is no fun, why engage in it? If I don't feel like I'm going to win, if I don't feel like I'm making progress, I'm going to give up, or I'm going to be depressed, or I'm going to always be sad, and that's no fun. Laugh at it, find victories, find ways. The stakes are super high. We know that, but there's got to be a bit of optimism and ideally a bit of fun, which is why we're here. Second thing I want to toss out. the terrible train wreck in Ohio, the politics of disasters playing. We've talked about this in previous podcasts. The blame game is afoot.
Mhm.
All right. One of the things that happens in disasters blame, comms people look at that. Final comms piece before I get on the weird is this interesting piece in the New York Times, February 15th. Again, had you not been inconveniently sick, we would have talked about this in a timely fashion. Just saying, Dave.
I'm so sorry about my health.
We all are. And I think maybe next time get sick when it's more convenient for me.
I'll ask you permission next time.
That would be nice. That's quite literally the very least you can do. There's the affirmative action is before the Supreme Court, and there's an interesting piece in the New York Times looking at how the initial affirmative action cases were framed.
Mhm.
And one frame is righting past wrongs, repairing damages. Another is diversity is good in itself because it prepares students for the world in which they're about to go enter. The latter frame ended up bringing over some conservative Nixon appointed judges. And it is what Alito and Thomas are going after now. So the initial frame that helped pass it, the Supreme Court, signed off on it the first time, that framing that might actually potentially be its undoing this time. Right. And we've seen this in several cases with the court. How you frame an issue for the court and the public discourse has political implications, which can help you win in the short term, but maybe can hurt you in the long term. I think it's a really interesting sort of mini affirmative action case study.
I think so. I haven't gotten to read that piece yet. My gut reaction though is that this still comes down to structural power.
Yeah.
Right. Like they took over the court, and once they took over the court, they decided what are the policy outcomes we want, and how can we reason our ways into getting that. I don't think an alternate frame changes that. Like once they have the structural power, they're going to wreak havoc, and that's what they're doing.
But there are some examples of framing the court working both for the court and public opinion. There's a piece on school vouchers. It's got to be 15 or 20 years ago now, but Clint Bollock, who ran the campaign for it, said if the dominant metaphor were the First Amendment separation of church and state, they would lose in the Supreme Court. They needed to make it about Brown v. the Board of Education and school access, equal school access. If you make that the political debate, that becomes the underlying metaphor, then that actually turned up in some of the court, some of the opinions written in the court. So I think that the framing is in the whole game. The structure also matters a lot, but I do think the argument you have going in at some level determines the argument coming out. It kind of gets back to the language conversation. Like when and how do you win, and then what's the long-term impact of that? I've got some bad news though. As you may recall from last time, weird news. The Marianne Williamson's running again for president, which is weird. I've got a fun thing which you are going to enjoy. So somewhere in the UK, there are potholes in the streets, right? And so local residents are under cover of darkness going out and drawing penises around the potholes because local officials won't pay attention to the potholes, but they will pay attention to penises drawn on the streets. And the people doing this have been nicknamed Wanksy. I think it's just awesome. Do what works, people. Comms, do what works. Bad news, according to the New York Times, podcast, the stupid money in podcast is drying up. So we're gonna have to continue to write checks to Alana.
That's all right. I've got a really good advertising strategy for us.
Go.
Let's get Marianne Williamson to advertise on our podcast. Huh?
I think
we'll start shilling for Marianne Williamson. We could do it.
Our podcast listenership would increase by the low single digits, I think. The bad news.
Vibes out there, because also that's her strategy for winning politics.
Putting vibes.
I am putting out vibes. Marianne Williamson, give us a call.
I'd like that money karma. The cash karma. We did hear from a loyal listener who said, there are all these metrics you can do, maybe attract some advertisers. If you break down who's listening, it's like, yeah, we get all of that. We're just not, there aren't enough of them to matter to anybody. But there would be if somebody wrote us a check. But none of this may matter because a Jurassic era moth was found at an Arkansas Walmart. So there's outside a parking lot of an Arkansas Walmart, there's a Jurassic era moth was found. So I'm a little afraid of that.
Like a living one?
Yeah. It hadn't been spotted for 50 years, which means apparently 50 years ago, there were Jurassic era Walmarts or moths flying around Walmarts. And apparently now there are invisible asteroids. So
I mean, technically, in that case, there have always been invisible asteroids. I don't think they just turned invisible, right?
One never knows. One never knows. So there's a lot to be afraid of. The things that
Office hours
others-
with Carp and Loge, this time with Loge being the gloom and doomy one.
I'm always the big doom guy. I'm optimistic, but we're doomed because we've got the Jurassic stuff. There are gorilla-sized penguin fossils being found in New Zealand. You're afraid of the real things. I'm afraid of the.
You're afraid of old moths.
Have you seen a Jurassic moth? I've seen Jurassic Park, all of them, which are traumatizing in its own way. But can you imagine getting together with a penguin? Is like the Mothra Godzilla thing going on in a Walmart parking lot in Arkansas. I think there's a lot to be afraid of.
We have reached to this point of the podcast where I need to blow Peter Loge's mind. Listeners, take a deep breath. It's time to tell him this. Peter, Jurassic Park was fiction.
That's what they want you to think. That's like the UFO thing. It's also a UFO, which is exactly what somebody who knew it was a UFO and didn't want us to think it was a UFO would say.
It was just a balloon.
Marjorie Taylor Greene is dressing up either as a Chinese spy or a space alien. And given a choice, I think the latter is more likely. Thank you. Thanks, Alana. As always, rate us, follow us, like us, tell your friends. The footnotes will be at peterloach.com podcast.
Maybe don't rate us.
They took me 40 minutes to get Dave to grab his face with his hands in shame or fear or dismay. I think that's what we got. See everybody in 2 weeks.
Bye, folks.